The dust in that office in Lublin didn't float. It hung suspended in the heat, trapped like a fly in amber. I remember the taste of it, dry and chalky, coating the back of my throat every time I swallowed. It smelled of stale paper, the acidic tang of cheap ink, and the lavender water Oberleutnant Weber splashed on his neck to mask the scent of a losing war. They say smell is the strongest link to memory, but I don't know if that's true. Sometimes I think I invent the lavender because it makes him seem more human, more pathetic than he actually was. I was 28 years old, though my identification papers claimed I was 32. A dull-witted Pole named Janus who had flat feet and a talent for alphabetizing files. It is strange what the mind clings to. Before the world broke open, back in Moscow, I was a clerk, a real one. I worked at the gastronom on Tverskaya Street. It was a universe of perfect order. There were tins of Riga sprats stacked in pyramids, the labels all facing outward, watching the customers like silver eyes. There was the smell of damp wool in winter, and the sharp, brine-heavy scent of pickles in the barrel. I understood that world. A customer asked for buckwheat. I provided buckwheat. There was an exchange, a ledger, a balance. If a jar broke, we swept it up and adjusted the inventory. The war, I quickly learned, was just inventory management on a grotesque scale. Only the jars bled when they broke, and you couldn't sweep up the mess. In Poland in 1944, I tried to apply the logic of the grocery counter to the intelligence war. If I kept my head down, if I arranged the papers with the same reverence I once gave to jars of caviar, I would survive. I sat at a desk that was too small for my knees, shuffling requisition forms for the Wehrmacht. The sun beat against the window pane, bleaching the wood of the desk to the color of bone. Outside, trucks rumbled past, a low, constant vibration that rattled the nib of my pen against the inkwell. I didn't look out. Janus, the clerk, wouldn't look out. Janus cared only about the discrepancy in the shipment of woolen socks to the 4th Panzer Division. But the fear was a living thing. It sat in my chest, right behind the sternum, a cold, heavy stone that turned over every time the door handle turned. That afternoon, the door opened, and the air pressure in the room shifted. I felt it before I saw it. Oberleutnant Weber walked in, his boots striking the floorboards with a rhythm I had memorized. But there was a second set of footsteps, heavier, dragging slightly on the left. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a trapped bird throwing itself against the cage. I kept my eyes on the supply log, my hand trembling just enough to ruin the loop of a G. Janus, Weber said. His voice was soft, cultivated in a university lecture hall, not a parade ground. More paper. I looked up then, forcing my neck to move slowly, like a mechanism in need of oil. Beside Weber stood a man in a field gray uniform, dust caked in the creases of his eyes. He looked familiar, terrifyingly familiar. For a second the office in Lublin dissolved, and I was back in Moscow, in the queue for bread, or perhaps on the metro, standing shoulder to shoulder with this man. Had I sold him cigarettes? Had we attended the same mathematics lecture before the war took us? If he said my name, my real name, the charade would shatter. The pistol taped to the underside of the toilet tank down the hall would be too far away. The stranger's eyes swept over me, dismissed me as furniture, and returned to Weber. The fuel manifests, Oberleutnant. We are bleeding dry. He didn't know me. I was just a clerk, a Polish fixture. The stone in my chest settled, but the cold remained. I mumbled something in broken German, an apology for existing, and handed over the file. They turned away, discussing logistics, discussing the slow strangulation of their army. I went back to my ledger, but the numbers swam. This was the refusal, the deep, desperate wish to just be Janus, to be a man who worried about socks and ink, not a man holding the lives of thousands in the silence of his mind. I wanted to go home. I wanted to stack tins of sprats. Later that afternoon, the courier arrived with the routine supply manifest from the railhead. It was a boring document, a list of grain shipments and spare truck parts. I took it to my desk. To anyone else it was bureaucratic refuse. To me, it was a scream. I laid the paper flat, smoothing the creases. My eyes scanned the quantities. 14 crates of oats, 8 boxes of spark plugs, 4 drums of oil. The pattern was in the second digit of the serial numbers, a cipher we had agreed upon months ago in a damp cellar in Minsk. I translated the numbers in my head, converting them to the Cyrillic alphabet, keeping my face slack and bored. The message burned behind my eyes. No excuses. They wanted the impossible. They wanted me to crawl inside the German mind and steal their nightmares. I looked up, the manifest trembling slightly in my grip. Across the room, Oberleutnant Weber was sitting at his massive oak desk. He wasn't working. He was watching me. He held a cigarette poised halfway to his mouth, the smoke curling up in a lazy blue ribbon. He smiled a small, paternal tilting of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. It was the look a scientist gives a rat that has just successfully navigated a maze. He knew something, or perhaps he just enjoyed the way I sweated. The transition to the offensive didn't sound like a battle. It sounded like a thunderstorm that never broke. The artillery fire was a dull thudding on the horizon, a constant reminder that the front line was collapsing toward us, mile by bloody mile. But inside the office, the war was silent. It was fought in the scratching of pens and the locking of cabinets. I had to cross the threshold. The order was absolute. I couldn't just observe anymore. I had to provoke. I remembered my instructor, a man with hands like shovels and a voice like grinding gears. He had told us. Weber was a smart man. He had been a professor of architecture in Dresden before the uniform claimed him. He loathed incompetence, but he loved mentorship. He treated the war like an unruly thesis student he had to discipline. I took the weekly fortification report, a document classified enough that I shouldn't have understood it, but low-level enough that I was allowed to file it. I dipped my pen in the inkwell. The black liquid pooled on the nib. I found the section detailing the concrete density for the bunkers along the river. The figure was 47. Deliberately, with a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else, I wrote 74. It was a transposition error, a clumsy peasant mistake, a clerk's error. I waited. Time in that office moved like syrup. The clock on the wall ticked, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to grow louder with every swing of the pendulum. Tick-tock. 2 hours later, Weber's chair scraped against the floorboards. The sound was like a gunshot. "Janos," he called, and here. I stood up. My legs felt heavy, filled with lead shot. I walked the 10 paces to his private office. The air inside was cooler, smelling intensely of tobacco and leather. He motioned for me to close the door. The latch clicked shut, sealing us in. The ambient noise of the outer office, the typing, the phones vanished. It was just the two of us in the aquarium. Weber sat behind his desk. The report spread out before him. He looked tired. The skin under his eyes was bruised with exhaustion. He tapped the paper with a manicured fingernail. "Do you know why we are losing this war?" "Janos," he asked softly. I stared at his boots. I do not know, Herr Oberleutnant. The winter precision, he hissed, or the lack of it, the disintegration of detail. He spun the paper around so I could see it. "Look at this." "What is this number?" I squinted, feigning confusion. 74, sir. That is what was on the draft. "It is an impossibility," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Concrete of that density would crack under the frost heave in this soil. It is a structural absurdity. If we built the Vistula line with these numbers, the Russians wouldn't need to shell us. The bunkers would collapse on our own heads." He leaned back, studying me. This was the test. He wasn't just correcting a number. He was probing the depth of my ignorance. If I showed too much understanding of engineering, I was dead. If I showed too little, I was useless and would be sent to dig trenches. I had to be the perfect balance. The diligent idiot. "I am sorry, sir," I stammered, wringing my hands. "I only copied the numbers. I wanted to be exact. I do not know about concrete. I only know the ledger." Weber sighed, a long exhalation of smoke. He watched me for a long moment, his eyes drilling into my skull. I could feel the sweat trickling down my spine, icy cold. "You are a good clerk, Janus," he said finally, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But you have the imagination of a brick." "Yes, sir. Thank you. It is not a compliment." He stood up and walked to the corner of the room. There was a large metal filing cabinet there, secured with a heavy iron padlock. I had watched that cabinet for 3 months. I had dreamed about that cabinet. Weber placed his hand on the cold metal. "A pity a man of your diligence is wasted on supply logs and concrete density," he murmured. He looked at the cabinet, then back at me, a strange, predatory glint in his eyes. It was the look of a man who was lonely in his intellect, a man desperate to show off, even to a fool. "In here," he said, tapping the steel door, "are plans that would make your head spin. True genius at work. The hydraulic defenses, the flood plains. We are going to turn the river itself into a weapon." My breath caught in my throat. He was giving it to me. He was dangling the bait. He smiled that terrible, paternal smile again. "But such things are not for Polish clerks. Go back to your desk, Janus, and fix the number. It is 47. Always 47. He turned his back to me to look out the window, but the challenge hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. He had shown me the lock. Now he was waiting to see if I was foolish enough to look for the key. 3 days later, I engineered the crisis. It was a subtle sabotage, the kind only a clerk could devise. I transposed the concrete density figures on the weekly requisition forms, creating a mathematical impossibility that would stall the entire fortification supply chain if sent to Berlin. When the telegram from headquarters arrived, demanding the finalized logistics report within the hour, Weber began to unravel. He paced the small office, cigarette ash falling onto his pristine uniform, muttering about Polish incompetence and the idiocy of the Central Command. I stood by the door, shrinking into my coat, making myself look small, terrified, and utterly indispensable. I waited for his panic to peak before I spoke. I told him the discrepancy was in the historical aggregate, a mismatch between the current poor rates and the foundational limits. I told him I could fix it, but I could not balance the equation without the original survey data. The data in the cabinet. Weber looked at the clock. He looked at the unfinished report that could end his career. He looked at me, the harmless, dull-witted Janus who was good with numbers but bad with concepts. Desperation is a powerful key. He swore softly, walked to the corner, and pulled the iron padlock from the hasp. The cabinet swung open. It smelled of dry paper and dust. He pulled out a thick roll of blueprints and slammed them onto his desk, weighting the corners with heavy brass ashtrays. There it was, the Vistula River line. It was not just a map. It was an anatomy of death. I stepped closer, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my face remained slack, awash in simple confusion. I needed him to explain it. I needed the context to make the lines meaningful. I pointed a trembling finger at the intricate cross-hatching along the riverbank. I asked if those were drainage ditches for the autumn rains. Weber laughed, a sharp barking sound. He began to lecture. He traced the lines with his manicured fingernail, explaining that they were not ditches, but flood-controlled kill zones. He showed me how the German engineers planned to blow the levees at specific intervals, channeling the river to turn the solid ground into a quagmire exactly where the Soviet tanks would try to cross. He showed me the hidden artillery pockets, masked by the tree line, calibrated to fire into the mud where the tanks would be stuck. I had to become a camera. My eyes swept over the grid coordinates, the elevation markers, the troop density numbers. I carved them into the gray matter of my brain. Sector 4, heavy mortars. Sector 7, dummy bunkers. The bridge at Puloy, rigged for demolition. But memorizing was not enough. To keep him talking, to keep him revealing the secrets, I had to feed his ego. I had to praise the machine that was built to slaughter my brothers. I told him it was genius. I told him it was a masterpiece of order. I looked at the spots on the map where I knew my friends in the Zarya group would be advancing, and I smiled a sycophant smile. I said the Soviets were clumsy beasts who would walk right into the trap. I said the German mind was superior to the Slavic horde. Every word was bile in my throat. I felt a profound self-loathing, a spiritual rot spreading through me, but I kept nodding. I was collaborating with my soul to save my mission. Weber was flushed with the pleasure of his own intelligence. He tapped a specific junction on the map, a high ridge overlooking the crossing point. He explained the overlapping fields of fire. I leaned in, too eager, and the mask slipped for a fraction of a second. I saw the geometric perfection of the ambush, and I forgot to be Janus. And the enfilade fire from the north, I murmured, tracing the angle. It covers the blind spot of the lower bunker perfectly. Nothing survives that crossfire. Silence slammed into the room. Weber's finger stopped moving. He did not look up immediately. He stood there staring at the map, his breath catching in the sudden stillness. Slowly he raised his head. The paternal warmth was gone, extinguished like a candle in a gale. His eyes were cold, blue glass. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see a clerk. He saw the predator standing inside the clerk's skin. Enfilades, he repeated, the word hanging in the air. You use the vocabulary of a tactician. Janus, you follow the geometry of slaughter with remarkable ease for a man who only pushes paper. He moved his hand toward the drawer where I knew he kept his Luger. Who are you? The air in the room turned solid. I had one heartbeat to decide. If I reached for the knife in my boot, we would both die, and the intelligence would die with us. I had to kill him with words. I had to retreat so deep into the lie that it became the truth. I widened my eyes, letting my jaw drop in a caricature of stupidity. I let out a nervous, high-pitched giggle. I told him I did not know what that word meant. I told him I only saw the shapes. I told him it looked like the Sunday crossword puzzle in the Krakow newspaper, where the lines have to cross to make the words fit. I told him I loved puzzles because they made the chaotic world feel small and tidy. I babbled about how the lines on the map looked like the rows of soup cans in the shop where I used to work. Everything in its place, nothing messy. Weber froze, his hand hovering inches from the drawer. He studied my face, searching for the intelligence he thought he had seen. I gave him nothing but a vacuum. I was the empty shop clerk. I was the simpleton who liked neat rows. Slowly the tension drained from his shoulders. He scoffed, shaking his head in disgust. He called me a simpleton. He told me to fix the numbers and get out of his sight. He closed the drawer. I finished the report with trembling hands, my mind screaming the coordinates of the Vistula defenses over and over again, burning them into my memory. I left the office 10 minutes later. I walked out into the rain, the cold water mixing with the sweat on my face. I did not run. I walked at the pace of a tired worker going home. I made it to the safe house, signaled the emergency extraction, and vanished. The journey back to the Soviet lines was a blur of mud and terror. I spent 3 days hiding in barns and moving through forests, reciting the map to myself like a prayer. Every checkpoint was a potential gallows. I didn't sleep. I couldn't risk dreaming and forgetting a single artillery placement. When I finally saw the red star on the cap of a sentry near the river, I didn't cheer. I collapsed. I poured the contents of my mind out to the intelligence officers of the 1st Belarusian Front. I drew the map from memory, every bunker, every floodgate. They called me a hero. They said my information saved thousands of lives during the crossing. But I never felt like a hero. I returned to Moscow, but Janus never really left me. I went back to my life, but the world had changed. I had been a shop clerk before the war. I understood the world through inventory. A tin of tea, a bag of flour, everything had a price and a place on the shelf. But in that office, I had taken inventory of a different kind. I had tallied the cost of betrayal, and I realized that to save the store, I had to burn down the shelves. The hardest part was not the fear of death. It was the moment I had to genuinely admire the enemy's intellect to survive. I had to look at a plan designed to murder my people and call it beautiful. I had to agree with the logic of the butcher. That act of profound intellectual dishonesty left a scar that never healed. I realized that in war, You don't just sacrifice your body, you sacrifice your truth. You have to let a piece of yourself love the enemy just enough to understand him. And that piece never comes back. The ledger of my soul never balanced again. I look at bridges now, and I don't see engineering. I see kill zones. I see the geometry of the grave. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.